The rain came down hard that October evening, turning the Manhattan streets into rivers of gray. David pushed his daughter's stroller faster, trying to keep the plastic cover from blowing away. His old marine jacket was soaked through, but at least Sophie was dry inside her little bubble, clutching her worn teddy bear. It had been another day of rejection. 7 interviews, 7 polite smiles, 7 versions of, "We'll call you." David knew what they saw when they looked at him. The tattoos creeping up his neck, the way he still stood too straight, too alert, the gaps in his resume that screamed damaged goods louder than his honorable discharge papers ever could. Sophie started fussing. She was hungry, and David had exactly $12 in his wallet until Friday. $12 that needed to cover dinner tonight, breakfast tomorrow, and maybe some milk if he was lucky. He'd already skipped lunch. Again, almost home, sweetheart, he said softly, even though home was still 20 blocks away. The subway would have been faster, but the crowds down there made his hands shake. Too many people, too many exits to watch, too many sounds that his brain insisted were threats. They were passing the Hartwell Tower when it happened. The building rose up like a giant made of glass and steel, so tall David had to crane his neck to see the top disappear into the clouds. Rich people lived and worked there, the kind of people who didn't know what a can of beans cost or how long you could stretch a single pack of pasta. "Hey, you there." A security guard jogged toward him, and David's body tensed automatically. His hand moved to protect Sophie's stroller, placing himself between her and the approaching figure. Old habits, but the guard was smiling. Middle-aged, a little out of breath, completely unthreatening. "Sorry to startle you, man. You look strong. You want to make some quick cash?" David's eyes narrowed. Nothing in life was free, and quick cash usually meant something sketchy. Doing what? Moving a piano, upstairs in the ballroom. Delivery guys put it in the wrong spot, and we've got a big charity thing starting in an hour. Everyone's running around like crazy. The guard shrugged. Boss said to find someone who looks like they can handle heavy lifting. I'll give you $100 cash right now. 30 minutes of work tops, $100. That was groceries for 2 weeks. That was the overdue electric bill with money left over. David looked down at Sophie, who was chewing on her bear's ear, completely oblivious to her father's calculations. 150, David heard himself say. He hated negotiating, hated asking for anything, but Sophie needed new shoes. The ones she had were too small, and he'd been stuffing tissue paper in the toes to make them last another month. The guard laughed. "You drive a hard bargain. Fine, come on." David followed him into the building, pushing the stroller through doors that probably cost more than his car. The lobby was all marble and gold, with a chandelier that looked like it was made of diamonds. His wet boots squeaked on the polished floor, and he felt suddenly aware of how out of place he was. A soaked veteran with a stroller, trailing water across floors that someone probably cleaned hourly. The elevator ride to the 40th floor made his ears pop. Sophie giggled at the sensation, and despite everything, David smiled. That sound was worth more than all the marble and gold in the world. The ballroom was chaos. People in suits and fancy dresses rushed around with clipboards and headsets. Waiters carried trays of champagne. Someone was arguing about flower arrangements, and there in the corner sat a massive grand piano, shiny and black and clearly in someone's way. "Just needs to go over there," the guard said, pointing to a raised platform on the other side of the room. "Think you can handle it?" David had moved artillery in the desert. He could move a piano. He parked Sophie's stroller near the wall where she could see him, made sure the brake was on, and approached the instrument. It was heavier than he expected, but he knew the physics of it. How to lift, how to balance, how to move something 3 times your weight without throwing out your back. He was halfway across the ballroom when he felt eyes on him. Not the casual glances of busy staff, but the focused attention of someone studying him. David looked up and saw him. The man stood on the balcony overlooking the ballroom, hands in his pockets, watching with the kind of intensity that made David's skin prickle. He was maybe 60, gray hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than David's entire year of rent. Everything about him screamed money and power. David finished positioning the piano and stepped back, rolling his shoulders. The guard appeared with a relieved smile and 5 crisp 20s. "You're a lifesaver, man, thanks." David pocketed the money and turned to get Sophie, but a voice stopped him cold. "Play something. It wasn't a request." The man from the balcony now stood 10 feet away, and up close David could see the calculation in his eyes. This was someone used to being obeyed, someone who bought and sold companies before breakfast. "I'm just here to move the piano," David said carefully. "I know what you're here for. I'm telling you to play it. One song." David felt his jaw tighten. "I don't play. Your forearms say otherwise." The man gestured to David's tattoos. "Those aren't just decorations." David glanced down at his arms. The ink was old, faded in places from sun and time. Most people saw the military insignias, the dates, the symbols. They didn't look close enough to see what was woven between them. "I need to get my daughter home," David said, moving toward the stroller. $5,000. David stopped. He must have heard wrong. "What?" "Play one song on that piano and I'll pay you $5,000. The man pulled out his phone, tapped something, and showed David a banking app. "I'll transfer it right now." "Before you even sit down? Why?" David's mind raced. This was insane. People didn't just throw around that kind of money for a song. "Because I want to know if I'm right about you." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And because if you refuse, I'll make one phone call and ensure you never get hired anywhere in this city again. I own enough buildings, enough companies, enough people to make sure of that." The words hung in the air like a threat. David felt the anger rising in his chest, hot and familiar. This was exactly why he hated people like this. They thought everything and everyone had a price. They thought power gave them the right to control other people's lives. But then he looked at Sophie. At her two small shoes and her threadbare coat. At the future he was trying to build for her out of nothing but stubborn determination and love. "One song," David said quietly. "Then I leave." The man smiled and gestured to the piano bench. David walked over, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since combat. He hadn't sat at a piano in 15 years. Not since before everything fell apart. Not since the last time he'd been whole. He lowered himself onto the bench and stared at the keys. Black and white, perfectly aligned, waiting. His hands hovered over them, trembling slightly. In the corner of his vision, he could see Sophie watching him with wide, curious eyes. David closed his eyes, took a breath, and let his fingers fall to the keys. And just like that, the music came flooding back. The first notes came out shaky. David's fingers felt stiff, unfamiliar with the keys they'd once known so well. But then something clicked. Muscle memory took over, and suddenly he wasn't in a fancy ballroom anymore. He was 17 again, playing for his mother in their tiny apartment while she hummed along from the kitchen. The melody shifted and changed. What started as something classical transformed into jazz, then something else entirely, something that didn't have a name. His left hand laid down a rhythm while his right hand danced across the higher keys, telling a story without words. A story about sand and heat and fear, about letters from home that arrived too late, about holding a newborn baby while your hands still shook from things you couldn't talk about. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Waiters stood frozen with their trays. The woman arguing about flowers had her hand over her mouth. Even the people on their phones had looked up, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. David didn't notice any of it. His eyes were closed, and the music poured out of him like water from a broken dam. 15 years of silence, 15 years of pushing it all down, and now it was flooding out through his fingertips. The piano became an extension of his body, and for the first time since he'd come home from overseas, David felt like himself again. The final notes hung in the air, soft and sad and somehow hopeful. David opened his eyes and found himself staring at the keys, breathing hard like he'd just run a mile. His hands were still on the piano and he could feel them shaking now. The applause started slowly, then built until it filled the entire room. David stood up quickly, uncomfortable with all the attention. He just wanted to grab Sophie and get out of here. Take the money and disappear before anyone asked questions he didn't want to answer. But the man in the expensive suit was blocking his path, and his expression had completely changed. The calculation was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shock. "You're him," the man said slowly. "You're David Chen, the David Chen." David's stomach dropped. No one had called him by his full name in years. Not since he'd stopped using it, stopped being that person. "I don't know what you're talking about," David said, trying to move around him. "Juilliard's youngest admission. Carnegie Hall at 15. They called you the next great prodigy." The man pulled out his phone again, fingers flying across the screen. "I thought you looked familiar, but the tattoos, the age. I didn't put it together until you played." People were gathering now, phones out, whispering to each other. Someone had already found the old footage. David could hear it playing from multiple phones. A tinny version of his 15-year-old self on that Carnegie stage. Confident and whole and completely unaware of everything that was coming. That was a long time ago, David said quietly. He could see Sophie starting to fuss in her stroller, picking up on his tension. "What happened to you?" the man asked, but it wasn't cruel. It sounded genuinely curious, almost concerned. "You were supposed to be the greatest pianist of your generation. Then you just vanished." David looked at him for a long moment. At this billionaire who thought he could understand, who thought money and power gave him the right to know everything. But there was something in his eyes that made David pause. Something that looked almost like grief. "Life happened," David said finally. "Can I have my money now? My daughter needs to get home." The man glanced at Sophie, then back at David. "Sebastian Hartwell," he said, extending his hand. "And I have a proposition for you." David didn't shake his hand. "I'm not interested. 2 weeks from now, I'm hosting a private gala. International press, donors from around the world, people who collectively control more wealth than most countries." Hartwell pocketed his phone. "I want you to perform 1 hour. Your choice of music. No. $1 million. The number hit David like a physical blow. $1 million. That was Sophie's college fund. That was a house with a backyard where she could play. That was security, stability, everything he'd been trying to build for her, one rejection letter at a time. "I don't perform anymore," David said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "You just did, and it was extraordinary." Hartwell stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I know about the tattoos. Not just the military ones, the others." David instinctively pulled his sleeves down, but it was too late. When he'd been moving the piano, when he'd been playing, his jacket had ridden up. The ink that covered his forearms wasn't just random designs. It was sheet music, bars and notes woven into an intricate pattern that ran from his wrist to his shoulders. "That's your mother's composition," Hartwell said softly. "The one she wrote for your Carnegie Hall debut. The one she never got to hear performed because she died 3 months before the concert." David felt his throat tighten. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there that night. Front row. My daughter was a violinist, and I took her to see you play because her teacher said you were something special." Hartwell's voice had gone quiet. "You dedicated the performance to your mother. You said the music was tattooed on your heart, and someday you'd tattoo it on your skin so you'd never forget her." David remembered that night. Standing on that stage, terrified and excited, pouring everything into that performance because it was what his mom had wanted, what she'd worked 3 jobs to pay for. The lessons, the practice time, the belief that her son could be something more than another kid from Queens. "I kept that promise," David said, touching his sleeve. "Got the tattoo right after I enlisted." "Why did you enlist?" Hartwell asked. "You had scholarship offers from every major conservatory in the country." David looked over at Sophie. She'd fallen asleep in her stroller, her little hand still clutching her teddy bear. "My wife got sick, cancer. We needed health insurance, steady pay, something reliable. The military offered all of that." He paused. "I was going to go back to music after her treatment. That was the plan. But she didn't make it," Hartwell said quietly. "She died while I was deployed. I came home to a baby who didn't recognize me and a medical debt that would take me 20 years to pay off." David met his eyes. "So no, I didn't become the greatest pianist of my generation. I became a father instead, and I don't regret that choice." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer. "My daughter died when she was 16. Car accident on the way to a competition. She was supposed to debut with the Berlin Philharmonic that year. I'm sorry," David said, and meant it. "I buried myself in work after that. Built an empire because I couldn't stand to be still. Couldn't stand to think about all the music the world would never hear." Hartwell looked at the piano. "When I heard you play just now for the first time in 15 years, I heard something that reminded me of her. That same raw talent, that same ability to make people feel something real." David shook his head. "I'm not your second chance. I'm not your redemption project. I'm not asking you to be." Hartwell pulled out a business card and pressed it into David's hand. "I'm asking you to think about it. 1 performance. You choose everything, the music, the style, the message. I just provide the audience and the money. And if I say no," Hartwell smiled slightly, "then you say no. The $5,000 is already in your account. No strings attached. But David, I saw your face when you played. That wasn't obligation. That was someone coming back to life. David pocketed the card without looking at it. He moved past Hartwell and unlocked Sophie's stroller. His daughter stirred but didn't wake. As he pushed her toward the elevator, he could feel dozens of eyes on him. Phones were still out, recording, posting, spreading the story of the vanished prodigy who'd been found moving furniture in a billionaire's building. In the elevator, David finally looked at the card. Just a name, a number, and an address. Nothing fancy. He should throw it away. He should take Sophie home, pay some bills with the $5,000 and forget this ever happened. But his fingers still tingled from the piano keys. And for the first time in 15 years, David had felt something other than tired. The black car was waiting outside David's apartment building when he came down the next morning, not parked nearby or idling down the street. Right there, directly in front of his door like it had been expecting him. David stopped on the stairs, Sophie's hand in his. She'd been chattering about pancakes for breakfast, but now she went quiet, staring at the sleek vehicle that looked completely out of place in their neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and overflowing dumpsters. A driver stepped out, older gentleman in a crisp suit. "Mr. Chen, I have something for you." David's first instinct was to turn around and go back inside, but Sophie was already tugging his hand, curious. The driver opened the back door and pulled out an envelope, thick and cream-colored. Inside was a contract. David skimmed it quickly, his heart sinking with every line. A luxury apartment near Lincoln Center available immediately. A practice schedule with some instructor whose name David vaguely recognized from his Juilliard days. 4 hours of daily training, childcare provided. And at the bottom, a check for $10,000 marked as an advance. There was a note paper clipped to the contract, written in sharp, precise handwriting. "Training begins today. Car will wait as long as necessary. The choice is yours, but so are the consequences, Sebastian." "Dad, why is that man staring at us?" Sophie whispered. The driver wasn't staring, just waiting patiently. But David understood what she meant. This wasn't a choice. It was pressure dressed up as an opportunity. Accept, and Hartwell would control the next 2 weeks of his life. Refuse, and there'd be consequences. The kind of consequences a billionaire could arrange with a single phone call. David thought about the rent due in 3 days. The electric bill he'd been putting off. Sophie's doctor appointment next week that his insurance wouldn't fully cover. He thought about his pride, about how much he'd already swallowed just to survive, and realized this was just one more thing to choke down. "Give me an hour," he told the driver. They packed quickly. Sophie thought it was an adventure, chattering about seeing new places. David didn't correct her. He threw clothes into a duffel bag, grabbed Sophie's favorite books and toys, and tried not to think about what he was agreeing to. The apartment Hartwell had arranged was on the 15th floor of a building with a doorman and an actual chandelier in the lobby. Inside, it was all clean lines and huge windows overlooking the city. There were 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that sparkled, and a piano. Of course there was a piano, a beautiful upright positioned by the window where the light would hit it perfectly. Sophie ran from room to room, squealing with delight. David stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. A woman arrived within the hour. Mid-50s, kind eyes, introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson. She'd be looking after Sophie during David's practice sessions. She had references, experience, came highly recommended. She also had that look that told David she'd been briefed on the situation, told to handle things carefully because the veteran might be fragile. The instructor arrived next, Robert Chen, no relation, which he clarified immediately with a slight smile. He'd been 3rd chair at the New York Philharmonic before retiring to teach. David remembered hearing him play once, years ago. The man was legendary. "Sebastian told me about you," Robert said, sitting at the piano and running his fingers over the keys. "Told me you haven't played seriously in 15 years. "That's right. But last night you played a 20-minute improvisation that had half the room in tears." Robert looked up at him. "So either you're a natural genius or you've been practicing in secret." "Neither. I just remembered." Robert studied him for a long moment. "Muscle memory is remarkable, but it won't carry you through a full performance in front of hundreds of people. Your technique will be rusty. Your stamina won't be there. And playing under pressure with everyone watching, that's different from playing alone in a ballroom." David knew he was right. He'd felt it last night, the way his hands had cramped toward the end, the way his back had ached from sitting wrong. His body wasn't 17 anymore. "We have 13 days, Robert said. "Let's see what we can do." The first practice session was brutal. David's fingers stumbled over passages he used to play in his sleep. His timing was off. His posture was terrible, and after just an hour, his hands were shaking with fatigue. "Again," Robert said, not unkindly but firmly. David played the same section again, and again, and again. By the time they finished, 3 hours had passed, and David felt like he'd run a marathon. Every muscle in his back and shoulders screamed. His fingers felt like they were on fire. Sophie was in the other room with Mrs. Patterson, playing with a collection of toys that had mysteriously appeared. She looked up when David came in and smiled. "Dad, listen to this." She pressed a button on some electronic toy, and it played a simple melody. David sat on the floor next to her, his body grateful for the rest. "That's nice, sweetheart. Mrs. Patterson says we can make cookies later. Real cookies, not the kind from the store." Sophie leaned against him. "I like it here. Can we stay?" David wrapped an arm around her, feeling the weight of the question. For a little while, that became the routine. Wake up, practice, eat something, practice more, spend time with Sophie, collapse into bed. Robert was relentless but never cruel. He pushed David hard, but he also knew when to back off, when the frustration was building to a breaking point. On the 4th day, Hartwell showed up unannounced. David was in the middle of a particularly difficult section, sweating with concentration, when he heard the door open. He looked up and saw the billionaire standing there, arms crossed, listening. David's hands froze on the keys. "I didn't hear you knock. I own the building. I don't need to knock." Hartwell walked closer. "You're getting better. Robert's a good teacher. Robert says you're fighting the music, that you're playing it like an obligation instead of a choice." Hartwell sat down in one of the expensive chairs that had come with the apartment. "Why did you agree to this, David?" "You know why. The money. That's not what I'm asking." Hartwell leaned forward. "You could have taken the 5,000 and disappeared. Changed your number, moved to a different part of the city. But you got in the car. You came here, why?" David's jaw tightened. "Because men like you don't take no for an answer. Because I have a daughter to think about. Because I'm tired of scraping by and pretending everything's fine when it's not. And because you wanted to play again," Hartwell added quietly. David didn't respond. Couldn't, because it was true. Last night, lying in bed, his hands still aching, he'd realized something. For the first time in years, he'd gone to sleep without the nightmares. Without jerking awake in a cold sweat, reaching for weapons that weren't there. The exhaustion from practice had knocked him out so completely that his brain hadn't had time to replay all the things he usually saw when he closed his eyes. "I'm not doing this for you," David said finally, "or for some comeback story. I'm doing it because Sophie needs stability, and this is the fastest way to get it." Hartwell stood. "Keep telling yourself that if it helps. But I've seen the way you look at that piano when you think no one's watching. That's not obligation. That's longing." After he left, David sat at the piano for a long time, staring at his reflection in the polished wood. His hands looked older than he remembered, scarred and calloused. But when he placed them on the keys and started to play, they still knew what to do. Sophie wandered in after a while, climbed up on the bench next to him. "Will you play the bedtime song?" David had made it up for her when she was a baby, a simple melody to help her sleep. He played it now, soft and slow, and Sophie hummed along. When he finished, she kissed his cheek. "You're really good at piano, Dad." "Thanks, baby." "Is that why we're here? So you can practice?" "Something like that." She thought about this for a moment. "Mommy would like hearing you play." The words hit him harder than they should have. Sophie barely remembered her mother, just fragments and photos and stories David told her. But somehow she knew exactly what to say. "Yeah," David said, his voice rough. She would. That night he pulled out the contract again and read through it more carefully. At the very end, in small print, there was a clause he'd missed before. After the performance, if both parties agreed, there would be opportunities for more work. Teaching positions, recording contracts, a pathway back into the world he'd left behind. David folded the contract and put it away. 2 weeks. He just had to survive 2 weeks. Then he could take the money and decide what came next. But as he drifted off to sleep, his fingers still moving unconsciously through scales and arpeggios, he wasn't sure anymore what he wanted that decision to be. It happened on day 9. David was playing through a complicated section, the notes flowing smoothly for the first time all week, when someone in the hallway dropped something. A door slammed. The sound cracked through the apartment like a gunshot. David was on the floor before he realized he'd moved. Under the piano, hands over his head, heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The apartment walls disappeared, replaced by sand and smoke and the screaming that never quite left his head. "Dad?" Sophie's voice cut through the panic, small and scared. David opened his eyes and saw her little face peering at him from across the room, eyes wide. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her, hand on Sophie's shoulder, clearly unsure what to do. "I'm okay," David managed to say, but his voice shook. "I'm okay, sweetheart." But he wasn't. His hands were trembling so badly he had to clench them into fists. Sweat dripped down his face. Every sound felt too loud, too sharp. He couldn't make himself crawl out from under the piano. The space felt safe, protected, like a foxhole. Sophie walked over slowly like she was approaching a scared animal. She sat down on the floor next to the piano and didn't say anything, just reached out and held his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his, warm and steady. They stayed like that for 20 minutes. Sophie sitting quietly, holding his hand, while David's breathing slowly returned to normal. Mrs. Patterson brought him water but didn't make a fuss. Just set it down within reach and took Robert aside when he arrived for the afternoon session. David heard them talking in hushed voices. Heard words like episode and trauma and maybe we should call someone. He wanted to tell them he was fine, that this happened sometimes, that he had it under control. But he didn't have it under control, and they all knew it. By the time Hartwell arrived that evening, David was sitting on the couch, Sophie asleep against his shoulder. He'd managed to get up, take a shower, pretend everything was normal. But his hand still had a slight shake, and he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. "Robert told me what happened," Hartwell said, sitting down across from them. "It's nothing, just a bad moment. It's not nothing." Hartwell's voice was firm but not unkind. "David, we need to cancel the performance." David's head snapped up. "What? No, you're not ready." "Not for this. I pushed too hard, expected too much." Hartwell ran a hand through his hair. "I've been so focused on what I wanted, on this idea of redemption or second chances, that I didn't stop to think about what it might cost you. I'm fine. You were under a piano having a panic attack. And now I'm not." David adjusted Sophie's weight against him, careful not to wake her. "Look, I've had worse. This happens sometimes. Loud noises, crowds, stress. It's part of who I am now. Exactly my point. You shouldn't have to perform in front of hundreds of people while dealing with PTSD." Hartwell pulled out his phone. "I'm going to transfer the full $1 million to your account. No performance necessary. Consider it payment for what you've already been through." "No. David, be reasonable." "I said no." David's voice was sharp enough that Sophie stirred slightly. He softened his tone. "I'm not taking charity, and I'm not quitting 4 days before the performance." Hartwell studied him for a long moment. "Why? The money's yours either way. Why put yourself through this?" David looked down at Sophie's sleeping face. "Because for the last 9 days I've felt like a person again. Not just a veteran, not just a struggling single dad, but someone with a purpose beyond just surviving." He paused. "When I play, the noise in my head quiets down. The memories don't disappear, but they get quieter. And last night, Sophie asked me to teach her piano. She's never asked me to teach her anything before. That's wonderful, but it doesn't mean you need to perform." "Yes, it does." David met his eyes. "Because if I quit now, I'm teaching her that when things get hard, you give up. I'm teaching her that fear wins. And I can't do that. I won't." Hartwell was quiet for a while. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay, but on one condition. You talk to someone. A therapist who specializes in veterans. I've done therapy. Then do it again, because what happened today could happen on that stage, in front of cameras and critics and everyone watching. And if it does, it won't just be you who pays the price. It'll be Sophie, seeing her father fall apart publicly." The words stung because they were true. David had been so focused on pushing through, on being strong, that he hadn't thought about what a public breakdown might do to his daughter. "Fine," he said, "but I'm still performing." The therapist's name was Dr. Ling, and she came to the apartment the next morning. David had expected someone clinical and distant, but she was warm and straightforward. She sat with him while Sophie played in the other room and asked him to tell her about the deployment. David hadn't talked about it in years. Not the details. But something about Dr. Ling made it easier. Maybe because she didn't look at him with pity. She just listened, nodding occasionally, taking notes. "The piano helps," she said after he finished. "It gives your brain something to focus on besides the hypervigilance. But you're also pushing yourself into a high-stress situation that could trigger more episodes. I know. So we need tools, grounding techniques, ways to pull yourself back when you start to spiral." She leaned forward. "David, there's no shame in what happened yesterday. Your brain is trying to protect you from threats it thinks are still there. That's not weakness. That's survival." They practiced breathing exercises, counting techniques, ways to recognize when the panic was starting before it took over completely. Dr. Ling also talked to Sophie, explaining in simple terms that sometimes Daddy's brain got confused and thought danger was happening when it wasn't. And the best thing she could do was stay calm and remind him where he really was. Sophie took it seriously, nodding like she'd been given an important job. "Like when I have bad dreams and you tell me it's not real?" "Exactly like that," Dr. Ling said with a smile. Over the next 3 days, David practiced with new intensity. Not just the music, but the mental exercises Dr. Ling had taught him. Every time his mind started to wander to dark places, he used the techniques to pull himself back. It didn't always work, but it helped. Robert adjusted the training schedule, building in more breaks, keeping the sessions shorter but more focused. They worked on the performance pieces, yes, but also on what would happen if David froze on stage, backup plans, exit strategies, ways to recover if things went wrong. "The greatest performers aren't the ones who never make mistakes," Robert told him. "They're the ones who know how to recover gracefully when they do." On the morning of day 12, 2 days before the performance, a music critic published an article. Someone had leaked the story and now it was everywhere. Washed up Prodigy returns, veterans' desperate comeback, or Billionaire's publicity stunt. The article was brutal. It questioned David's abilities, suggested he was being exploited, implied that Hartwell was using him for positive press. There were quotes from unnamed sources saying David had lost his edge, that 15 years away from music was too long, that the performance would be an embarrassment for everyone involved. David read it 3 times. Each time felt like a punch to the gut. The comments section was worse. Hundreds of people weighing in on his life, his choices, his worth. Some defended him, but most were skeptical or outright cruel. His phone started ringing. Reporters wanting interviews. People from his past reaching out, some with congratulations, others with barely disguised schadenfreude. The building's lobby had photographers camping out, hoping for a shot of the fallen Prodigy. Hartwell showed up that afternoon looking tired. "I'm sorry. I don't know who leaked it, but I'm handling it." "Handling it how?" "You can't unring a bell." David gestured to his phone. "Everyone's watching now. Everyone's got an opinion about whether I deserve this chance or if I'm just some charity case you're using for good publicity. What they think doesn't matter, doesn't it?" David stood up, pacing. "Because half those comments are right. I am washed up. I haven't performed in 15 years. I have panic attacks over doors slamming. What makes me think I can stand on a stage in front of hundreds of people and play like I used to? Because you did it 9 days ago in my ballroom and it was extraordinary. That was different. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't performing for anyone. I was just playing." Hartwell walked over and put a hand on David's shoulder. "Then do that again. Don't perform for the critics or the cameras or the people waiting for you to fail. Play for Sophie.
Play for your mother.
Play for yourself." David looked over at Sophie's room where she was supposed to be napping but was probably listening to every word. "And if I freeze? If I can't do it? Then you freeze and we deal with it." Hartwell's grip tightened slightly. "But David, I've spent 15 years letting fear make my decisions. Building walls, avoiding music, staying away from anything that reminded me of what I lost. And I can tell you from experience that safe is just another word for empty." That night, David couldn't sleep. He sat at the piano in the dark, Sophie asleep in her room, and played quietly. Not the performance pieces, just whatever came to mind. Old songs his mother used to love. Lullabies he'd made up for Sophie. Random melodies that meant nothing to anyone but him. And slowly, underneath the fear and doubt, he felt something else starting to build. Not confidence exactly, but determination. Let them watch. Let them judge. He'd survived worse than critics and cameras. He'd survived war and loss and years of barely holding it together. 2 more days. Then he'd show them what a washed-up veteran could do. The night of the performance arrived faster than David expected. One moment he was practicing in the apartment, and the next he was standing backstage in a suit that cost more than his last 3 months of rent, listening to the murmur of hundreds of voices on the other side of the curtain. Sophie stood next to him in a deep blue dress that she kept smoothing down with her hands. Mrs. Patterson had done her hair in braids, and she looked so grown up that David's chest ached looking at her. "You nervous, Dad?" she asked, squeezing his hand. "Terrified," he admitted. "Mrs. Patterson says it's okay to be scared. She says brave people are just scared people who do it anyway." David smiled despite the knots in his stomach. Mrs. Patterson is a smart lady. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see the audience filing in, designer suits and expensive jewelry, people who owned companies and influenced governments, critics with notebooks, cameras set up in the back, everyone waiting to see if he'd succeed or fail spectacularly. Hartwell appeared, looking sharp in a black tuxedo. "We're starting in 5 minutes. How are you feeling?" "Like I might throw up." "That's normal." Hartwell crouched down to Sophie's level. "Your dad is about to do something very brave. Make sure you watch every second, okay?" Sophie nodded seriously. "I will. I'm going to sit in the front row with Mrs. Patterson." After she left with Mrs. Patterson, Hartwell stood and faced David. "Listen to me. Those people out there, they don't matter. The cameras don't matter. The only thing that matters is you and that piano. Everything else is just noise. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to perform. No, but I'm the one who convinced you to do this. So if it goes badly, we fail together." Hartwell extended his hand. "Thank you for taking this chance. Whatever happens out there, you've already proven something to yourself. I can see it in the way you stand, the way you talk about the future. You're different than you were 2 weeks ago." David shook his hand, surprised to find he meant it. "Yeah, I guess I am." The stage manager appeared. "Mr. Chen, we're ready for you." David's heart started hammering. The breathing exercises Dr. Ling taught him, he needed those now. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Count to 4. Ground yourself in the present moment. You're in a theater in Manhattan. You're safe. Sophie is watching. You can do this. He walked onto the stage and the applause hit him like a wave. The lights were bright, almost blinding. The piano sat in the center, waiting. David made his way to it, each step feeling like walking through water. The audience quieted as he sat down on the bench. For a moment, he just stared at the keys. His hands hovered above them, shaking slightly. In the front row, he could see Sophie watching him with wide eyes, Mrs. Patterson's hand on her shoulder. Behind them, Hartwell stood with his arms crossed, but his expression was encouraging rather than demanding. David closed his eyes and remembered why he was here. Not for the money, though, that mattered. Not for the critics or the comeback story, but because his daughter had asked him to teach her piano, and he wanted to be someone worthy of teaching. Because music had given him 2 weeks where he felt more alive than he had in years. Because some part of him, the part that used to be a kid from Queens who loved making sounds turn into melodies, still existed under all the scars and trauma. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play his mother's composition, the one tattooed on his arms, the one he'd played at 15 in this same city, in a different venue when his whole life was ahead of him and anything seemed possible. The first notes were shaky, just like they'd been in Hartwell's ballroom 2 weeks ago. But then the music took over. His hands remembered patterns his brain had forgotten. The melody built and swelled, speaking of love and loss and the way mothers shape their children even after they're gone. The audience disappeared. The cameras disappeared. Everything disappeared except the piano and the music flowing through him. This was what he'd forgotten during the years of survival mode, of just putting one foot in front of the other, this feeling of being completely present, completely absorbed in something beautiful. The composition ended softly, the final notes hanging in the air like a question. The applause started, but David didn't pause. He moved directly into the second piece, the one he'd been composing over the last 2 weeks. A piece for Sophie. It was lighter than his mother's composition, playful in places, capturing the sound of a child's laughter, the rhythm of small feet running. But it had darker moments too, sections that spoke of worry and fear, of lying awake at night wondering if you're enough, if you're giving your child what they need. The music built to a crescendo that felt like hope, like the sunrise after a long night then resolved into a lullaby. The same one he played for Sophie every night, transformed and elevated but still recognizably theirs. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. David opened his eyes, suddenly aware again of where he was, of the hundreds of people watching. His heart raced. Had he messed up? Was the silence judgment? Then Sophie started clapping. Just her, alone at first, standing up in the front row with tears running down her face, applauding as hard as her small hands could manage. Mrs. Patterson stood next. Then Hartwell, then the entire audience rose as one. The applause wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous, overwhelming, the kind of response that shook the floor. David stood overwhelmed and found Sophie running toward the stage. Security tried to stop her, but Hartwell waved them off. She climbed the stairs and threw her arms around her father's waist. "That was the most beautiful thing I ever heard," she said into his jacket. David picked her up, holding her tight, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt like maybe he wasn't completely broken after all. Maybe the pieces could be put back together in a new way. Not the same as before, but something that still worked, that still made sense. Backstage was chaos. People wanted to talk to him, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. Record label executives pushing business cards into his hands, concert promoters talking about world tours, teaching offers from prestigious schools. Everyone suddenly wanted a piece of the comeback story. David held Sophie close and let Hartwell handle the crowd. The billionaire moved through them like he was born to it, deflecting, redirecting, promising statements later. He cleared a path to a private room where David could breathe. "That was incredible," Hartwell said once the door closed behind them. "Better than I imagined. The offers are going to be substantial." David set Sophie down and she immediately curled up on a couch, exhausted from the emotion and excitement. He covered her with his jacket and turned to Hartwell. "I'm not interested in most of them." Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "The symphony wants you to guest perform." "That's a huge opportunity. I know, and maybe someday I'll do it. But right now, I want something different." David pulled out his phone and showed Hartwell an article he'd bookmarked. It was about a veterans center across town that was losing funding, about to close its music therapy program. "I want to play there," David said, "and at other centers like it. Veterans who are dealing with what I deal with, who need something to focus on besides the noise in their heads. Their families and kids who need to see that there's life after trauma." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "That's not going to make you rich. I'm already rich. I have my daughter and now I have music back. Everything else is extra." David paused. "But I could use help organizing it. Making it bigger than just me showing up with a piano?" A slow smile spread across Hartwell's face. "You want to start a nonprofit." "I want to give other people what the last 2 weeks gave me. A reason to keep going. A way to turn pain into something beautiful." Hartwell pulled out his phone and started typing. "I know people. Funding won't be an issue. We'll need a mission statement, a board of directors, legal structure." He looked up. "This is going to take work. Real work, are you sure?" David glanced at Sophie, sleeping peacefully on the couch. 2 weeks ago, he'd been pushing her stroller through the rain, desperate and hopeless. Now he was standing in a private room planning a future that extended beyond just surviving until tomorrow. "I'm sure," he said. 6 months later, David stood in a community center in Brooklyn, teaching piano to a room full of veterans and their kids. The space wasn't fancy. The pianos were donated and out of tune, but the room was full of people making music, laughing, slowly remembering what it felt like to create something instead of just enduring. Sophie sat at one of the pianos, her small fingers picking out a melody David had taught her. Next to her, a veteran with one arm was playing bass notes, and together they were making something that almost sounded like music. Hartwell watched from the doorway. He'd funded the whole program, leveraged his connections to open centers in 5 cities, but he never took credit, never made it about himself. He just showed up sometimes, quiet and observant, and David suspected he was seeing his daughter in every kid who touched an instrument. "You did good," David said, walking over to him. "We did good," Hartwell corrected. "You're the one doing the hard work." David looked around the room at all the broken people slowly piecing themselves back together through music. "It's not work if you love it." That night, after everyone left and the center was quiet, David sat at the piano and played. Not for an audience, not for money or recognition, just for himself, for the joy of it. for the miracle of being alive and whole enough to make beautiful sounds. Sophie climbed up on the bench next to him. "Will you play our song?" David played their lullaby, and his daughter leaned against his shoulder, humming along. Outside, the city moved and breathed and lived. Inside, a man who'd been lost had found his way home. Not to the place he'd been before, but to somewhere new, somewhere better. The tattoo on his arm, the sheet music that had been both memorial and scar, felt different now, not like a reminder of what he'd lost, but like a map of where he'd been and proof that he'd survived the journey. Music had broken him once and saved him twice, and that seemed like the kind of story worth living.